Another Seize the Day. Today is Wednesday, May 18th, and we get another opportunity to spend some time together this morning. Trust you guys are doing well. Waking up feeling refreshed, ready to begin a new day. It's always good to be a part of our community, just opening up the Word and just getting ready for another day. Today in New Hampshire, skies are blue. Wind is kicking up a little bit, but the sun is shining. So it's going to be a good day, it looks like. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to meet with our young adults group. They meet out in Kittery. It's our 20 and 30-year-olds. Great group of people, so smart, really working hard to establish themselves, and at the same time, very interested in spiritual things. Going to have them over our home for a meal here soon. And at the same time, just talking from a passage in Peter where it says that the Lord is constructing his spiritual house using living stones. And we are those living stones. And I told him, in this construction of God's house, that construction, it is involving all of the material that's used on the construction site, right? So what God is doing for you and for me is giving us an awareness that the body of Christ includes everybody. All of us have a role to play. And so as we're playing that role out, God is going to use us in a way to form and fashion the church that he wants in this community of which we are a part. And that includes them. And so they need to feel like they own what's going on. And for that, I'm grateful. There is just this great sense of engagement. And so it was fun just to sit around and talk about matters of faith with those who are younger and just fixing their eyes on Jesus. So that was a really good thing. Well, as we begin our studies today, we have been really challenged by a question that was posed at the end of this miracle on the storm. Jesus comes, and we look at this passage that is found for us in Matthew 8, 18 through 27. Jesus rebukes some reluctant disciples. They want to be a part of this work of Jesus, but on their terms and probably for their own agenda. You kind of get that as you read Jesus's response to them. The one who says, "Look, I'll go anywhere and do for you. I'll follow you anywhere." And when Jesus presses him on that, he reminds him. He says, "Look, the foxes, they have holes, and the birds of the air, they have nests. But the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to lay his head." And so in that juncture, you begin to realize Jesus's response to this disciple is probably a response based on what the expectations were from that teacher of the law. Perhaps he thought his association with Jesus would result in maybe a deepening of his reputation. I don't want to put words in the guy's mouth. All I know is that Jesus's response was enough where the guy kind of withdrew his offer, and so you don't see him getting in that boat and following Jesus to the other side of that river. So it made us think a little bit more then about, all right, what is Jesus calling us to? And we began to think of other places in Scripture. Yesterday, I made reference to a quotation from a book that we had there was a quote from a man named Wilbur Reese. And it was a quote that he had as part of an essay that he wrote. But the quote was this. It says, "I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of him to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of a womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. And the whole tenor of this quote, right, is more about what we expect to get out of our walk with Jesus rather than what God is calling us to. Like the whole quote is about, I don't want explosions. I don't want my life to be unsettled. In fact, I would prefer that my religion comes in a really nice, easy way, kind of like that warm, a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want any transformation, right? I don't want this new birth. I just want my life to go easy, content. And if I could add a little bit of, faith and spirituality in there, then it's all good. But you realize that the further we're getting into this gospel of Matthew, that's really not an option. Jesus is calling us into a world that is, progressively becoming more and more antagonistic to his ways. We've already seen that in the in the way in which people are now beginning to approach Jesus. We're going to see that even more as we turn to chapter 9 and look at some of those passages there. But one of the things that also draws out to me when I look at these passages is a similarity to the language that we often find in these books, in these few verses here in Matthew 8, to the Old Testament events regarding God and his dealing with the storms that come. So let me just read from verse 23 in chapter 8 of Matthew. It says, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and without warning, a furious storm came on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. That word for storm is the word seismos, which literally means earthquake. And very often when these storms come, it has connotations of some kind of power, being displayed. And here, who's at the cause of this storm? We just know that it comes up on the lake. The waves begin to sweep over the boat. Jesus is asleep. Disciples wake him up, and they kind of know where this is going. In their head, they're saying, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. I often think you can't blame these disciples, right? I mean, they're seasoned fishermen. This must have been quite a storm that was, alarming. And they see it all going one way. But Jesus, who knows all things and who has all power, right? He's seeing this in an entirely different kind of light. And so consequently, for you and me, when we're in the storms of our lives, if we're not careful, we could also then jump to some conclusions that may not necessarily prove to be true. In this case, Jesus is going to rebuke them and tell them they have little faith. And why are they so afraid? Well, it's obvious that the storm is coming, but Jesus's rebuke, it should put a little pause in our spirit and say, why would he react like that? Because it would be pretty obvious. Like he ought to be a little bit more, understanding, or a little bit more in tune of what's going on with his disciples' lives. Which then pushes me back to, what have those disciples been experiencing of late? Have they not seen not just Jesus speaking truth, so that they would have some sense of assurance, right, that Jesus is on this mission now, proclaiming this kingdom of heaven, I mean, he's called them into the service. They're getting a front row seat into all that's going and taking place here. But they just bore witness to these miracles that Jesus was doing in so many places, not to mention the last three that had to deal with the leper, the Roman centurion, and Peter's mother-in-law, all of which had demonstrated something on the side of Jesus, that in his exercise of power, as we began to look at these miracles up close, we begin to see that Jesus is not only willing to express this power on behalf of those who come to him, but he shows that he's more than able, healing the centurion's servant with just a word. And that servant wasn't even in close proximity to Jesus at the moment, which is all the more, astounding to Jesus, because he is literally astonished at this man's faith, because he saw in Jesus authority. And that's where his faith rested, that Jesus was able. And so now you have those disciples who had just borne witness all these things. They're in this boat. They think they're going to die. And Jesus says, why are you so afraid? In other words, do you not know who's in the boat with you? And so he gets up, and what does he do? He rebukes the winds and the waves, and it becomes completely calm. The only other times that you read something that, approaches this is some Old Testament references that refer to the songs that were written about the parting of the Red Sea and the Israelites going through on dry land. And it literally uses those words, that he rebuked the waves and the winds. Psalm 107 was a great text here, and I'd like to show that to you here in Psalm 107, verse 25. It says, "For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. He brought them out of their distress." Listen to this. "He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven." See that? That's this text that we find for us now in Psalm 107. What a great text that is, that we begin to look at. And I'll put it up, so if you guys wanted to go and refer to this at another time, you'd be able to do that. So this is Psalm 107, and it's from verse 25 through 30. And I love when it says that he stilled the storm to a whisper, and he hushed the winds, and all grew calm, and he took them to this safe haven. See, this passage that I just quoted from Psalm 107, it is referencing God's actions. See, God did that, and now we're finding ourselves in this miracle that Jesus is performing in Matthew 8, 18 through 27. That miracle that Jesus is performing is something that only God does. So when they come to the end of this story, and then the question is, what kind of man is this? It's because what Jesus is doing can only be accounted for by God. God is the one that does these things. And then you begin to realize, you're like, oh, so the inference, right? The implicit inference is that Jesus is God. These men are trying to get their hands around that. And they're wondering, who is this? What kind of man is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? They've already had these other experiences. They're pushing them in that direction. But even for the disciples themselves, you could see this is a new faith. This is something that is growing, which also should give us some other kind of comfort here, my friends, because we recognize that this is something that God is doing in and through us. It's something that is going to grow. They didn't all of a sudden in one day turn around and become these disciples with no doubt, and we're all in. I mean, there were moments like, we're emotional beings too, right? It's not just this intellectual assent. It has to be with my will. It has to be with my own passions that I bring. And it took a little while for these disciples to get on board, fully on board. You see more and more as the days are coming, even leading up to the crucifixion, they become a little skittish. And part of that, I think, is not so much because they doubt Jesus as now this was going to touch their flesh. This was going to be something that they had to deal with. There was real fear there. The recrimination of the Romans, the backlash by the religious leaders. Some days they're probably feeling pretty strong, and yet, boy, when all this came down and soldiers are brandishing swords and they're arresting Jesus, there's this big trial. Boy, you can't. You have to say, yeah, this is a different level. And what pushed them over the edge there was seeing Jesus resurrected from the dead. And they realize, yeah, what can man do to me? Like I'm not going to fear the one who can kill this flesh. I'm going to fear the one who one day is going to pronounce judgment on my eternity. And now you begin to realize, oh, okay, this is something that is progressive. They are being transformed into the likeness of Jesus. So, I thought maybe for the next couple of days, I would show you something a little bit different. And I'd like to take us to the Book of Jonah. And I thought over these next couple of days, we'd see another storm. We'd see what God does in that storm. And maybe it would just remind us again of the power that Jesus is exhibiting here in Matthew. And the very next passage that's going to come is Jesus confronting evil spirits, right? And we're going to see how all of these things tie together because they are answering that question: what kind of man is this? All right, little joke time here. There was a pastor that kind of saw this little girl standing out a Sunday school classroom. She was in preschool, and she was waiting for her parents to come and pick her up from big church, right? So the pastor noticed that she clutched up one of these big storybooks under her arm, and the title of it was Jonah and the Whale. So pastor thought he'd have a little fun with the little girl, and he kneels down beside her. He says, "Hey, what do you have in your hand?" And she says, "Well, this is my storybook about Jonah and the whale." And he said, "Tell me something. Do you believe that story about Jonah and the whale?" And the girl just looked at him and she says, of course I believe it." And he says, "You really believe a man can be swallowed up by a big whale, stay inside him all that time and come out okay?" And the girl looked at him and she kind of furrowed her brow a little bit. And she said, "Well, yes, the story's in the Bible, and we talked about it in Sunday school today." He says, "Can you prove to me that this story is true?" And the little girl kind of stood there thinking for a minute. And then she says, "Well, when I get to heaven, I'll ask Jonah." And the pastor kind of chuckled. And then he says, "Well, what if Jonah's not in heaven?" And she waited a minute and she goes, "Then you can ask him." I know, little corny joke, but I thought the pastor had it coming. This story of Jonah isn't just for kids, though. In fact, when you'll see later on in this Gospel of Matthew, some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law are going to come to Jesus, And they're saying to him, we want to see a miraculous sign from you. And Jesus says to them, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The man of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now one greater than Jonah is here. You see, it's a story, when properly understood, it begins to demonstrate here that Jesus believed in the story of Jonah, and this story, it says that it is emblematic of Jesus spending 3 days and 3 nights, right, in this tomb, in as he says here, in the heart of the earth. And he says, and because of this, he says that the men of Nineveh are going to stand up in judgment against this generation, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now one is here who's greater than Jonah, and Jesus is applying, and you guys aren't responding at all. And so I think, wow, this is something that really needs to be addressed. So Nineveh was this great Syrian city, and it was up to the north. The Assyrians will eventually come down, and they're going to destroy the northern kingdom. Nineveh was great in size. It was great in power. It was great in miracle prowess. And there were around 5 times as many people living there as the people that lived in Jerusalem. A more impressive city probably could not have been found in that day. And the Lord is certainly against the wickedness that he found in Nineveh, part of this Assyrian empire, but he's also against Nineveh, herself, because this is where all this sin was being perpetrated. So what I'd like to do with you is just take a look at this passage, and as we do, just make a few comments with you, and we'll see again how God, uses a storm. All right. So here we find ourselves. He says, let me read. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. He says, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come before me. Right? So the Lord is sending Nineveh to preach against it. Notice what Jonah does. He ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. Tarshish is, people believe, all the way over near Spain on that Mediterranean. So he was being asked to go in the complete opposite direction. And now he decides, I'm going to get away from here as far as I can. So he runs away from the Lord, heads for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship. This is along the Mediterranean coastline, right? So he runs away, flees from the Lord, pays for a trip out of town, and heads off for Tarshish when he found the ship. And he went aboard, and there he goes. And so this is where I wanted you to see some of the connection with our story. What happens next? But the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. So you see, this was not the only time that people are experiencing these huge storms on the water. So what is he going to do? There is something here that is threatening their life. God sends this strong wind, and the ship is threatened, at sea. But notice here in verse 6, it says, Jonah goes below deck where he lays down and fell into a deep sleep. And the captain would say to him, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us and we will not perish. So Jonah sleeps the entire storm until he's awakened. Again, boy, it's kind of interesting how these stories can oftentimes, just remind us of some of these passages that Jesus is looking at are being described for us by Matthew. So what does the Lord do? Notice this. He says, the sailors, Jonah goes down, sleeps. The sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots. And so here in verse, it's verse 5, it's right. It says, but Jonah had gone below deck where he lay down, fell into a deep sleep. Captain went to him and said, hey, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he'll take notice and we will not perish. So the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. And they cast lots and the lot fell on Jonah. And so because these are pagans, right? They're thinking the gods must have been angry. And so therefore they're going to make this sacrifice, and they pick lots as to who's going to be chosen, and it falls to Jonah. So even within their own superstition, right? Even within their own pagan little custom here, you realize that God is still sovereign over all of these things. And so consequently, they don't realize God is the one who initiated the storm. And they don't even see that God is also working through their foolishness to really bring this story to head with Jonah. So the lot is cast, it falls on Jonah. So they come to Jonah and said, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? And so notice the clarity that you get from Jonah. He knows exactly who he is. He says, I'm a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. Nothing wrong with his understanding of who God is. Nothing wrong with his understanding of his role, right? And so the men were terrified and they said, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them. So here he is saying, I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the seas and everything, but I'm running away from him because he's asking me to do something that I really don't want to do. And now the people who are pagans think, well, that's probably not a good idea. If your God is asking you to do something, why would you be running away? And so consequently, there's the sea getting rougher and rougher. And so they ask him, what should we do to make the sea calm down for us? So they're looking for some kind of answer here. And so they his response is, pick me up, throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you. This storm has come upon them because of Jonah's rebellion. Remember, he doesn't want to go to the city of Nineveh, this great Assyrian city that's known for its wickedness. Assyria will be the ones who will come and they will eventually, wipe out the northern kingdom, right? They're going to overrun the northern kingdom of Israel. And because the northern kingdom had become just as pagan as their northern neighbors. There is no, they're engaged in all kinds of idolatry. They are not keeping God's word. That judgment is going to come. Nineveh are bad characters. So on one level, you could understand that Jonah says, there's no way. I don't want to go there. Why would I want to do that? And so his response is really, I am not going to do what God wants me to do. I'd rather run away. And then when he's there, he's even reconciled to the fact that all of this is coming because of his own disobedience, but he still doesn't want, he'd rather die than fulfill God's call on his life. Boy, what does that say about our own humanity, right? I mean, we could find ourselves in places like this. So I'd like to stop here, and tomorrow, just come back to our story, because there's this interaction between God and Jonah and God's will and ours. And I think those are lessons that the disciples on the boat with Jesus are beginning to understand too. That Jesus is oftentimes going to call us into circumstances, but his presence ought to be enough for us. Evidently, it wasn't enough for Jonah. At this point, he's telling them, look, it'd be a good thing if you guys just throw me overboard. You ever feel like that? You don't have it in you. I'm not really willing to see what God's long game is here. I just don't like what's before me right now. But it's not going to calm the sea. It's not going to bring you safely to a different haven. So I want to take a look at these stories as we continue in the Book of Jonah. You might want to read that. It's a great little short little story, and we'll spend that time because Jesus already drew the analogy between Jonah and the Son of Man, right? As Jonah was in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be for 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And yet, when he comes forward, he's greater than what we see here in Jonah. So take a look at that. I trust that these stories, what they do is they help us to just love God more deeply. So my friends, enjoyed this morning. Great story for the rest of the week. You go, seize the day, and remember that God is good all the time. God bless you.